Wyoming Territory, 1875. The unforgiving winter winds howled across the snow-dusted plains, bending the tall prairie grass in submission to nature's fury. Weston Everett pulled his worn leather gloves tighter as he guided his horse through the biting cold. At 25, he had already seen enough hardship to last several lifetimes. The Civil War had stolen his youth, the frontier had hardened his resolve, and loss had taught him that attachment was a luxury a man couldn't afford in these untamed lands. "This territory takes more than it gives, old boy," he muttered to his faithful buckskin gelding, Copper. The horse snorted in response, sending plumes of warm breath into the frigid air. "Folks who plant roots here just give the wind something more to tear away." Weston adjusted the worn Stetson that shadowed his face, a handsome one despite the weathering of frontier life. His clean-shaven jaw clenched against the cold, the strong lines of his face softened only by hazel eyes that betrayed a gentleness he worked hard to conceal. Though young, his broad shoulders carried the invisible weight of a man who had learned too early that the frontier rewarded solitude and self-reliance above all. 3 years of driving cattle between Texas and Wyoming had taught him one immutable truth. A cowboy had no business dreaming of hearth and home. Not when tomorrow could bring rustlers, blizzards, or the countless other ways the West had of killing a man. The ranch hands he'd buried along the way, some friends, some merely acquaintances, had only reinforced his conviction. Connection meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant death on the frontier. As the silhouette of whispering pines came into view, Weston sighed. The small Wyoming settlement hardly deserved to be called a town, but it marked the end of his long journey north. The cattle drive had concluded 2 days prior at the nearby Chapman Ranch, and his pockets now held enough money to see him through until spring roundup. All he wanted was a hot meal, a bath, and a bed that wasn't the hard ground. What he didn't expect was her. The Widow's Rest boarding house sat at the edge of town, a 2-story structure that somehow looked both sturdy and delicate against the vast Wyoming landscape. As Weston approached, the door swung open, and a young woman stepped onto the porch, shaking out a tablecloth. The wind caught her honey-blonde hair, pulling strands free from her simple bun as her blue calico dress danced around her ankles. For a moment, Weston forgot the cold. Pearl Chapman had been told she was beautiful, though at 22, such compliments meant little to her now. Beauty hadn't saved her husband from the fever that took him 16 months prior, leaving her with a boarding house, a mountain of debt, and the crushing weight of solitude in a town where a young widow was either pitied or pursued. Her delicate features had hardened somewhat from the constant work of running the Widow's Rest, but her clear blue eyes still held a warmth that belied her circumstances. She had learned to be practical above all else. Romance was a luxury that had nearly destroyed her when John died. She had loved deeply and lost completely. Now survival was all that mattered. As the stranger approached on horseback, Pearl automatically smoothed her apron and tucked a wayward strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture of habit rather than vanity. Another drifter looking for lodging, no doubt. They came and went with the seasons, bringing gossip and trouble in equal measure but rarely staying long enough to become more than a name quickly forgotten. "Afternoon, ma'am," the rider called, his voice carrying across the yard. "Any rooms available for a weary traveler?" Pearl assessed him with a practiced eye. Young but not too young, strong-built but not intimidating, clean-shaven, which was a rarity among the cowboys who typically stumbled into town after months on the trail. His clothes were trail-worn but well-maintained, a man who took pride in his appearance despite the hardships of the road. $3 a week gets you a room and 2 meals a day," she replied, her tone businesslike. "Baths extra. No drinking, no fighting, and no women in your room. Those are my terms." Weston couldn't help but smile at her directness. "Yes, ma'am, I reckon I can abide by those rules." He dismounted smoothly, his boots crunching in the thin layer of snow. "Weston Everett just finished a drive up from Texas." "Pearl Chapman," she nodded curtly. "Stables around back, get your horse settled, then come in through the kitchen. I'll show you to your room." As she turned to go inside, Weston noticed the slight droop of her shoulders, a woman carrying a burden too heavy for her frame. Something about her stirred an unwelcome feeling in his chest, a recognition of shared loneliness he immediately tried to dismiss. "Just passing through," he reminded himself as he led Copper toward the stable. "Always just passing through." Inside the boarding house, Pearl leaned against the kitchen counter, steadying her breathing. Something about the cowboy's direct gaze had unsettled her. Not in a frightening way, but in a manner that made her suddenly, acutely aware of how long it had been since she'd really looked at a man, or had one really look at her. Don't be foolish, she whispered to herself. He's just another drifter who'll be gone with the spring thaw. The sound of boots on the back porch pulled her from her thoughts. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and prepared to be simply what she had been for the past 16 months. The widow who ran the boarding house, nothing more, nothing less. What neither realized was that fate had other plans, plans that would test every conviction they held about love, loss, and survival on the frontier. For in the midst of Wyoming's harshest winter in memory, two souls determined to remain unattached would discover that sometimes the heart finds its home in the most unexpected places. 2 days into his stay, Weston found himself watching Pearl more than he cared to admit. She moved through the boarding house with quiet efficiency, serving meals, mending linens, keeping accounts in a leather-bound ledger with neat, precise handwriting. She rarely smiled, not a full smile anyway, but occasionally her lips would curve slightly when old Mr. Harrison, the town's retired schoolteacher, would tell one of his long-winded stories at dinner. That evening, as a blizzard raged outside, the dining room of the Widow's Rest felt almost cozy. The other boarders, Mr. Harrison, the Wells brothers who worked at the lumber mill, and Miss Abigail Foster, the dressmaker, created a strange sort of family around the table. The passes will be closed for weeks with this snow, Samuel Wells commented, passing the bread basket to his brother James. Looks like we're all stuck here together a while longer. Pearl set down a pot of stew in the center of the table. The pantry's well stocked and we have plenty of firewood. We'll weather it just fine. Weston noticed the slight worry in her eyes despite her confident words. Running a boarding house through a harsh winter was no small feat. Food, fuel, and finances all became precious commodities when the snow isolated small frontier towns from supply lines. I'm handy with repairs if anything needs fixing, he offered, surprising himself with the words. And I don't mind chopping extra wood while I'm here. Pearl's eyes met his, a flicker of something, gratitude, perhaps, crossing her face before she quickly looked away. Thank you, Mr. Everett, that would be helpful. Weston, he corrected gently, Mr. Everett was my father. The smallest hint of a smile touched her lips. Very well, thank you, Weston. Something shifted in that moment, an invisible wall lowering just enough to allow a glimpse through. For Weston, it was dangerous territory. Getting involved, even in small ways, led to attachment. Attachment led to pain. He knew this as surely as he knew that winter gave way to spring and that the frontier would always claim more than it gave. Yet the next morning found him in the yard behind the boarding house, splitting logs with methodical precision, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline world of white, the sky an impossible blue above the snow-covered pines. Pearl appeared at the back door, a mug of steaming coffee in her gloved hands. You didn't need to start so early, she called, making her way carefully across the packed snow. Weston paused, resting the axe against the chopping block. Sleep doesn't come easy these days. Figured I might as well make myself useful. She handed him the coffee, their fingers brushing briefly through their gloves. Nightmares. The question caught him off guard. Most folks didn't ask directly about such things, especially not women of gentle upbringing. But there was nothing coy or hesitant in her inquiry, just simple understanding. Sometimes, he admitted, taking a sip of the strong, black coffee. The war, the trail, they have a way of following a man even in sleep. Pearl nodded, looking out across the white expanse behind the house. I understand. After John died, I would wake up reaching for him, only to find empty space. She spoke matter-of-factly, without the tearful tremor that often accompanied such confessions. The mind knows what's happened, but the heart takes longer to accept it. Weston studied her profile, seeing not just the beauty that had first caught his attention but the strength beneath it. This was no fragile flower wilting under the weight of widowhood, but a woman who had faced her grief head-on and continued forward. How long were you married? He asked. 3 years, she answered. We came west from Pennsylvania right after our wedding. John had dreams of building something from nothing. A sad smile touched her lips. He got the boarding house half built before the fever took him. You finished it yourself, Weston stated rather than asked, admiration coloring his tone. Pearl nodded. Had to. It was either finish what we started or return east in defeat. Her chin lifted slightly. I don't believe in defeat, Mr. Ever Weston. Before he could respond, a commotion from the street drew their attention. A wagon was approaching at a dangerous speed, the horses straining against their harnesses, a man shouting frantically from the driver's seat. Help, we need help, the man called as the wagon skidded to a halt in front of the boarding house. Weston was already moving, setting down his coffee and striding toward the street Pearl closed behind. In the back of the wagon lay a woman, her face contorted in pain, her swollen belly making her condition obvious. "My wife," the man gasped, jumping down from the wagon. His face was young beneath his beard, panic clear in his eyes. "The baby's coming. We were trying to reach the doctor in Riverton, but the snow's too deep. Someone in town said you might help, said there's a widow who helps with birthings." Pearl's expression shifted immediately from concern to calm determination. "Bring her inside," she instructed, already turning toward the house. "Weston, help him carry her to the ground floor guest room." Without hesitation, Weston climbed into the wagon. The woman looked at him with fearful eyes. "It's going to be all right, ma'am," he said with a gentleness that surprised even him. "My name's Weston, what's yours?" "Sarah," she whispered between pained breaths. "Sarah Miller." "My husband is Thomas." "Well, Sarah, we're going to get you somewhere warm and comfortable," Weston said as he carefully gathered her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected despite her condition, and he could feel her trembling. "Mrs. Chapman knows what she's doing. You and your baby will be just fine." As he carried Sarah inside, following Pearl's brisk instructions, Weston realized he had no idea if Pearl actually had any experience with childbirth. But something in her confident manner suggested this wasn't the first time she had faced such an emergency. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Pearl transformed from quiet boarding house proprietor to commanding presence, directing Weston to heat water, Thomas to hold his wife's hand, and Miss Foster to prepare clean linens. Mr. Harrison was sent to fetch Mrs. Wilkins, the midwife who lived on the other side of town, though the deep snow made her arrival uncertain. "Have you done this before?" Weston asked quietly as he set a kettle of water to boil. Pearl tied an apron around her waist, her sleeves already rolled up past her elbows. "3 times since John died, Mrs. Wilkins has been teaching me." She met his gaze steadily. "I never had children of my own, but I know enough to help until she arrives." The simple statement held volumes of unspoken pain, but there was no time to dwell on it. Sarah's cries were growing more frequent, and Pearl disappeared into the bedroom, closing the door behind her. Weston found himself pacing the kitchen, jumping at every sound from the bedroom. Thomas sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands, murmuring prayers. The Wells brothers had gone to clear a path to Mrs. Wilkins' house, while Mr. Harrison kept watch from the front window. "First child?" Weston asked Thomas, needing to break the tense silence. The young man nodded, not looking up. "We homesteaded 20 miles from here last spring. Should have waited to start a family, but—" He finally raised his head, his eyes red-rimmed. "We wanted so badly to fill our home with life." Weston handed him a cup of coffee, unsure what comfort to offer. His own belief that family was a vulnerability on the frontier seemed cruel to voice to a man whose wife was fighting to bring new life into the world. "Your wife seems strong," he said instead, "and Mrs. Chapman won't let anything happen to her or the baby if she can help it." Thomas gripped the coffee cup like a lifeline. "How do you know her, Mrs. Chapman, I mean?" "I don't really," Weston admitted, "just passing through, taking a room until the trail's clear." A cry from the bedroom, sharper than before, brought both men to their feet. Then moments of silence that stretched unbearably until the unmistakable sound of a baby's first wail pierced the air. The door opened and Pearl appeared, her face flushed with exertion but her eyes bright. "You have a daughter, Mr. Miller," she announced, a genuine smile transforming her features. "A healthy little girl, come meet her." As Thomas rushed past her into the bedroom, Pearl leaned against the doorframe, suddenly looking exhausted. Without thinking, Weston moved to her side, offering his arm for support. "You did it," he said softly. Pearl accepted his arm, her usual reserve momentarily forgotten. "We did." "All of us?" She looked up at him with something like wonder. "She's so perfect, Weston, so small and perfect." In that moment, with her guard down and her face alight with the miracle she had helped bring into the world, Pearl was breathtaking. Weston felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the wall he had built around his heart. "You're something else, Pearl Chapman," he murmured, and for a heartbeat they stood connected not as widow and drifter, but as two people sharing in something profound. The spell broke when Mrs. Wilkins finally arrived, bustling in with her medical bag and taking charge of the situation. Pearl slipped away to wash up, and Weston returned to the kitchen, unsettled by the strange warmth spreading through him. A warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the stove and everything to do with a honey-blonde widow who had just revealed depths he hadn't expected. Dangerous, he muttered to himself as he stared out at the snow-covered yard. Getting involved is dangerous. But as the baby's cries echoed through the boarding house, a sound of new life in the midst of winter's grip, Weston couldn't help but wonder if some dangers might be worth facing after all. The Millers stayed for 3 days while Sarah regained her strength. They named their daughter Pearl, much to Mrs. Chapman's embarrassment and secret pleasure. When they finally departed, the entire boarding house gathered to see them off, the tiny bundle wrapped carefully against the cold for the journey home. "You ever think about having a family of your own?" Weston asked Pearl as they watched the wagon disappear down the snow-packed road. The question slipped out before he could stop it, crossing a boundary he had carefully maintained since his arrival. To his surprise, Pearl didn't rebuff him or retreat behind her usual reserve. "I did once," she said quietly, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "With John. We tried, but it wasn't to be." She turned to look at him directly. "And you, does the great cowboy Weston Everett ever imagine settling down?" There was a teasing note in her voice he hadn't heard before, a lightness that transformed her usually serious demeanor. "A cowboy's life doesn't leave much room for family," he replied, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "Hard to put down roots when you're always chasing the horizon." Pearl studied him with those clear blue eyes that seemed to see more than he wanted to reveal. "Is that what you're doing, chasing the horizon, or running from something behind you?" The question hit too close to home and Weston felt his jaw tighten. "Maybe a bit of both," he admitted after a long moment. "The war left scars that aren't so easy to show. Easier to keep moving than to stay in one place long enough for folks to see them." Pearl nodded, understanding in her gaze. "Well, we all have scars, Weston. Some are just more visible than others." She glanced down at her left hand, where her wedding band still encircled her finger. "But scars mean you survived something. There's strength in that." Before he could respond, she turned back toward the boarding house. "I should start dinner. The Wells brothers will be hungry when they return from the mill." Weston watched her go, struck by the grace with which she carried her grief, not as a burden that crushed her, but as an experience that had shaped her into the woman she now was. It made his own determination to remain detached seem less like wisdom and more like fear. That evening, as the boarding house residents gathered around the dining table, Weston found himself truly looking at the community Pearl had created. Mr. Harrison regaling everyone with tales of his teaching days back east, the Wells brothers arguing good-naturedly about politics, Miss Foster sharing news from her sister's latest letter from Denver, and Pearl moving between them all, serving food, refilling coffee cups, adding an occasional comment or quiet laugh. It wasn't just a boarding house, it was a home. And despite his best efforts to remain an observer, Weston realized he had somehow become part of it. After dinner, as the others retired to their rooms or the small parlor, Weston lingered in the kitchen where Pearl was washing dishes. "Let me help," he offered, picking up a dish towel. She looked surprised but didn't object. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the gentle splash of water and the clink of dishes being dried and stacked. "Why did you stay?" Pearl asked suddenly, her hands pausing in the soapy water. "After the cattle drive ended, I mean. Most cowboys head straight for the saloons and then move on, but you've been here almost 3 weeks now." Weston carefully dried a plate, buying time as he considered his answer. The truth was he wasn't entirely sure himself. The snow had made travel difficult certainly, but not impossible. He could have moved on. "I suppose I needed the rest," he said finally, "and it's peaceful here." He glanced at her profile, illuminated by the soft glow of the oil lamp. "You've created something special, Pearl, a place where folks feel welcome. That's rare out here." She blushed slightly at the compliment, resuming her washing. "It wasn't intentional. After John died, I just needed to survive. The boarding house was our dream, but finishing it alone was about necessity, not vision." Her voice softened. "But somewhere along the way, it became more than just walls and a roof. The people who stay here, even temporarily, they become a kind of family." "Is that what I am?" Weston asked, the question slipping out before he could reconsider. "Temporary family." Pearl's hands stilled again, and she looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I don't know what you are, Weston Everett," she said honestly. "You help with chores without being asked. You play checkers with Mr. Harrison every evening even though he always wins. You fixed Miss Foster's sewing machine when it broke." She shook her head slightly. "You act like a man who belongs somewhere, all while insisting you're just passing through." The assessment was uncomfortably accurate. Weston set down the towel, suddenly needing some distance. I should check on Copper before turning in, he said, retreating toward the back door. Good night, Mrs. Chapman. Pearl, she corrected softly. If I'm to call you Weston, then you should call me Pearl. He paused with his hand on the doorknob, the simple invitation carrying more weight than it should. Good night, Pearl, he said, and stepped out into the cold night air. In the stable, Copper greeted him with a soft, nickering sound. Weston stroked the horse's nose, finding comfort in the familiar ritual. What am I doing, boy? He murmured. Getting attached to a place, to people, to her, that's not the plan. The plan had always been simple. Work, save money, keep moving. The war had taught him that bonds formed in blood and hardship were the quickest to devastate when broken. The frontier had reinforced the lesson. Those who survived were those who relied only on themselves. Attachment was weakness, love was vulnerability, and yet, Pearl Chapman's boarding house felt more like home than anywhere he'd been since before the war. The woman herself, with her quiet strength and perceptive gaze, had somehow slipped past defenses he thought impenetrable. Just until spring, he told himself firmly. When the snow melts, we move on, that's how it has to be. But as he made his way back to the house, he couldn't help but notice how the warm light from the windows seemed to beckon him inside, away from the cold loneliness of the night. And for the first time in years, the prospect of moving on brought no sense of freedom, only a hollow ache he wasn't ready to examine too closely. February brought a brief thaw, turning the packed snow to treacherous slush during the day before freezing solid again each night. The town of Whispering Pines stirred from its winter hibernation as the main street became passable again, allowing for deliveries and visitors to reach the previously isolated businesses. One such visitor arrived at the Widow's Rest on a particularly mild afternoon. Weston was repairing a loose porch rail when the stranger approached, a well-dressed man in his 40s, his expensive coat and polished boots marking him as someone of means. Good day, the man called, tipping his hat. I'm looking for Mrs. Pearl Chapman. Is this her establishment? Something in the man's tone, a familiarity perhaps or an expectation, put Weston immediately on edge. It is, he replied, straightening to his full height. She's inside. May I ask who's calling? The stranger offered a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. An old family friend, Edward Calloway from back east. I'm sure she'll be delighted to see me. Before Weston could respond, the front door opened and Pearl appeared. She froze at the sight of Calloway, her face draining of color. Edward, she breathed, one hand gripping the doorframe for support. What are you doing here? My dear Pearl, Calloway moved forward, taking her hand before she could withdraw it. When I heard about John's passing, I was devastated. I've come to offer my condolences and assistance. Pearl extricated her hand from his grasp, her composure returning though her face remained pale. That's very kind, but as you can see, I'm managing quite well on my own. Yes, so it appears. Calloway's gaze swept over the boarding house and lingered briefly on Weston. Still, there are matters we should discuss, business matters that John entrusted to me. Weston watched the exchange with growing concern. Pearl's usual self-assurance had vanished in this man's presence, replaced by a wariness that bordered on fear. Mr. Everett, Pearl turned to him, her voice steadier than her expression. Would you mind checking on the kitchen stove? I believe Miss Foster mentioned it was smoking earlier. The request was clearly a dismissal, allowing her to speak privately with Calloway. Everything in Weston rebelled against leaving her alone with this man who had so obviously unsettled her, but he respected her enough to honor her wishes. Of course, Mrs. Chapman, he replied formally, letting her know with his tone that he understood her signal. I'll see to it right away. As he passed her on the porch, their eyes met briefly. In that fleeting moment he tried to convey reassurance, that he would be nearby if needed, that she wasn't alone. The slight nod she gave in return suggested she understood. Inside, Weston positioned himself in the kitchen, which afforded a view of the front parlor through a partially open door. He could see Pearl and Calloway seated, their conversation too quiet to overhear, but their body language spoke volumes. Calloway leaned forward intently while Pearl sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Miss Foster entered the kitchen, raising an eyebrow at Weston's obvious eavesdropping. That man brings trouble, she said softly, joining him by the stove. He came to John's funeral, you know, made quite a scene, trying to convince Pearl to sell the boarding house and return east with him. Who is he to her? Weston asked, not taking his eyes from the parlor. John's former business partner from Pennsylvania. There was some falling out before they came west. Miss Foster's voice dropped even lower. Some say Edward wanted Pearl for himself and couldn't bear that she chose John instead. Weston's jaw clenched at this revelation. The way Calloway looked at Pearl, possessive, calculating, suddenly made disturbing sense. In the parlor, Pearl's voice rose enough to be heard. "Absolutely not, Edward. I've told you before I have no intention of selling. This place was John's dream, our dream, and I've worked too hard to give it up now." Calloway's response was too low to catch, but his hand moved to cover Pearl's, and she immediately pulled away, standing abruptly. "I think you should leave," she said, loud enough now that her words carried clearly to the kitchen. "Whatever business you claim to have with John's estate can be directed to Mr. Thornton at the bank. He handles all my affairs now." Calloway rose slowly, his pleasant mask slipping to reveal something harder beneath. "You always were stubborn, Pearl. John indulged that trait far too much." He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. "Perhaps this will help you reconsider my offer. Take some time to read it carefully. I'll call again tomorrow for your answer." He placed the envelope on the small table between them and turned to leave, pausing when he saw Weston watching from the kitchen doorway, no longer pretending not to observe. "Your handyman seems quite protective," Calloway remarked to Pearl, his tone laced with insinuation. "How fortunate for a young widow to find such dedicated help." Weston stepped fully into the parlor, his expression neutral but his stance unmistakably challenging. "Mrs. Chapman values her privacy, Mr. Calloway. I'm sure a gentleman such as yourself can appreciate that." The two men measured each other silently, the tension between them palpable. Finally, Calloway smiled thinly and reached for his hat. "Until tomorrow, Pearl," he said, ignoring Weston entirely as he departed. When the front door closed behind him, Pearl sank back into her chair, her composed facade crumbling. She stared at the envelope on the table as if it might bite her. "Pearl," Weston moved to her side, dropping to one knee to better see her face. "Are you all right? Who is that man, really?" She looked at him, her blue eyes troubled. "Edward Calloway was my father's choice for a husband. When I married John instead, he seemed to accept it graciously. But after we moved west, John discovered Edward had been embezzling from their business for years." Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the envelope. "John confronted him, dissolved their partnership, and we left Pennsylvania with what little we could salvage." "And now he's back wanting to buy the boarding house?" Weston asked, fighting the urge to take her hands in his. Pearl nodded, carefully opening the envelope. "He's been trying since John's funeral. Says it's the only responsible thing for a widow to do." Her voice took on a bitter edge. "As if I'm incapable of managing on my own." She withdrew a document from the envelope, scanning its contents. As she read, her face paled further and Weston could see her breathing quicken. "What is it?" he asked gently. Pearl handed him the paper, her hand shaking. "It's a promissory note signed by John. According to this, he borrowed $5,000 from Edward 3 months before he died." She shook her head in disbelief. "That's impossible. John would have told me. We were struggling to finish the boarding house, yes, but not desperately enough to borrow from Edward of all people." Weston examined the document carefully. The signature did appear to match the one he had seen on the boarding house ledger that Pearl kept in her small office. The terms were straightforward but brutal, the entire amount due within 2 years of signing, with the widow's rest property listed as collateral. "The note comes due next month," Pearl whispered, the implications sinking in. "I don't have that kind of money, Weston, not even close." "Could John have borrowed it without telling you?" Weston asked, hating to cause her more pain but needing to understand the situation. Pearl's eyes flashed with sudden fire. "No. We had no secrets, especially about money." She stood and began pacing the small parlor. "This is Edward's way of taking what he's always wanted, me and anything John valued. The signature looks real, but this loan never happened." "I'm certain of it." Weston believed her. In the weeks he had known Pearl, he had come to recognize her honesty and integrity. If she said the loan was fraudulent, then it was. "We'll figure this out," he said, surprising himself with the "we." It implied a partnership, a shared problem, a connection he had been carefully avoiding acknowledging, but seeing her distress, he couldn't bring himself to correct it. "Don't meet with him alone again. Whatever happens next, you don't face it by yourself." Pearl looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing past the drifter persona to something underneath. "Why do you care, Weston? You're just passing through, remember." The question was direct, challenging him to confront the contradictions in his own behavior. He had maintained for weeks that he was temporary, just waiting for spring to move on. Yet here he was, involving himself deeply in her troubles, making promises that extended beyond his planned departure. "I care because," he began, then faltered, unable to articulate feelings he barely understood himself. "Because no one should face someone like Calloway alone, because what he's doing isn't right." He met her gaze steadily. "And because you matter, Pearl, to a lot of people in this town, to the folks in this boarding house." "To me." The last words hung between them, an admission he hadn't intended to make. Pearl's expression softened, vulnerability replacing her earlier anger. "Thank you," she said simply, reaching out to touch his arm briefly. "For being here, for seeing through him immediately." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "John would have liked you, I think. He always said you could judge a man by how quickly he recognized a snake in the grass." The mention of her husband created a strange mix of emotions in Weston: respect for the man Pearl had loved, regret that he would never meet him, and a complicated guilt about his growing feelings for the widow that man had left behind. "We should speak to Mr. Thornton at the bank," Weston suggested, steering the conversation back to practical matters. "If the loan is fraudulent, he might know how to prove it." Pearl nodded, her practical nature reasserting itself. "Yes, first thing tomorrow, and I'll need to review all of John's papers again. There might be something I missed." As they made plans, Weston realized with sudden clarity that the solitude he had cultivated for so long no longer felt like protection. It felt like isolation. Here, in this moment of crisis, standing beside Pearl as she faced a threat to everything she had built, he felt more alive, more purposeful than he had in years. The cowboy who had convinced himself that attachment was weakness now found himself willingly, deliberately entangling his fate with Pearl's. And strangely, rather than feeling vulnerable, he felt stronger for it. What he didn't yet understand was that in helping Pearl fight for her home, he was also fighting for something he had long denied himself: the possibility of belonging somewhere, of belonging with someone. The following morning brought a harsh return of winter. Heavy snow fell in thick curtains, and bitter wind rattled the windows of the boarding house. Pearl and Weston sat in Mr. Thornton's office at the Whispering Pines Bank and Trust, the promissory note spread on the desk between them. "I'm afraid the document appears legitimate," Thornton said, adjusting his spectacles as he examined the paper. "The signature matches our records of Mr. Chapman's handwriting, and the seal is correct." The banker, a thin, precise man in his 50s, looked up at Pearl with genuine sympathy. "However, there is no record of such a large sum being deposited in your husband's account around that time." "Because the loan never happened," Pearl insisted, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Edward Calloway is attempting to defraud me of my property." Thornton nodded thoughtfully. "I believe you, Mrs. Chapman. Mr. Calloway's reputation preceded him to Whispering Pines." "Unfortunately, believing and proving are different matters entirely." He tapped the document. "In the eyes of the law, this is a valid debt. Without evidence of forgery, you would be obligated to pay or forfeit the collateral." "There must be something we can do," Weston said, leaning forward in his chair. "What about John Chapman's business records? Would there be any trace of such a large transaction?" "Perhaps," Thornton conceded. "Mrs. Chapman, did your husband keep ledgers, correspondence, anything documenting his financial affairs?" Pearl nodded. "Yes, John was meticulous about our finances. Everything is in his office at the boarding house. I've reviewed it all since his death, and there was never any mention of borrowing from Edward." Her brow furrowed in concentration. "But John did write to his former business associates in Pennsylvania occasionally. He might have mentioned something about Edward's attempts to contact him." Thornton rose from his desk. "I suggest you search thoroughly, Mrs. Chapman. Look for any correspondence from the months before your husband's passing. Meanwhile, I will send a telegram to my colleague at the Pennsylvania Banking Association. Perhaps they can provide information about Mr. Calloway's financial activities around the time this loan supposedly took place." As they prepared to leave, Thornton added, "Be careful, both of you. Men like Calloway don't take kindly to being challenged, and with the judge not due in town for another month, legal recourse will be slow in coming." Outside, the snow had accumulated several inches, making the walk back to the boarding house treacherous. Weston offered his arm to Pearl, which she accepted without hesitation. They moved carefully through the deserted street, the town silent under winter's heavy blanket. "He'll come today," Pearl said, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "Edward. Despite the weather, he's not a man who tolerates delays." Weston's arm tightened slightly around hers. "Let him come, we'll be ready." They spent the morning in John's small office, a room Pearl had preserved almost exactly as her husband had left it. The Wells brothers and Miss Foster joined the search, combing through ledgers, correspondence, and legal documents for any mention of Edward Calloway or the supposed loan. "Here's something," James Wells said after an hour of silent searching. "A letter from John to someone named William Garrett in Philadelphia, dated about 4 months before his passing." Pearl took the letter eagerly, scanning its contents. Her face brightened as she read. "This is it. John mentions that Edward had contacted him, claiming financial hardship and asking for a loan." She looked up triumphantly. John refused him. "He writes that he would sooner trust a rattlesnake than give Calloway access to any of our remaining funds." "That proves he wouldn't have borrowed from Calloway," Miss Foster said. "But it doesn't prove the document is a forgery." "No, but it establishes motive," Weston pointed out. "Calloway was in financial trouble, approached John for money, and was refused. That gives him reason to fabricate a debt after John's death." They continued searching until midday, finding several more letters that referenced Calloway's increasingly desperate attempts to extract money from the Chapmans. In one, John mentioned his suspicion that Edward might attempt to travel west to press his case in person. "He never came, though," Pearl said, arranging the letters chronologically. "At least not while John was alive." "But he was watching," Weston suggested, "waiting for an opportunity when he heard of John's death. He saw his chance to claim what he's always believed should be his," Pearl finished, her voice hardening. "The business, the property, and," she trailed off, but Weston understood the unspoken implication. Calloway wanted Pearl herself, had perhaps always wanted her. The sound of a carriage approaching interrupted their discussion. From the window they could see Edward Calloway climbing down from a hired buggy, his expensive coat dusted with snow. "Let me handle this," Weston said, moving toward the door. Pearl caught his arm. "No, this is my fight, Weston, my home, my husband's memory." Her blue eyes were clear and determined. "But I would appreciate having you beside me." Something in her words, the balance of independence and acceptance of support, struck Weston deeply. Here was a woman who needed no man to fight her battles, yet was wise enough to recognize the strength in not fighting alone. "Always," he promised, the word carrying more weight than he had intended. They met Calloway in the parlor, the letters spread strategically on the small table. Pearl stood straight, her honey-blonde hair neatly arranged, wearing a simple blue dress that somehow made her look both vulnerable and formidable. "Edward," she greeted him coolly, "I've reviewed your document." Calloway smiled, removing his gloves with deliberate slowness. "And you've come to your senses, I trust. The boarding house in exchange for the debt, a fair arrangement under the circumstances." "Actually," Pearl said, gesturing to the letters, "I've found some interesting correspondence from my husband. He documents quite clearly your financial troubles and your attempts to secure money from him, attempts he repeatedly refused." Calloway's smile faltered slightly. "What John wrote to his friends is hardly relevant. The promissory note speaks for itself." "A note that mysteriously appeared only after his death," Weston interjected, standing slightly behind Pearl's right shoulder. "For a loan that never appeared in any of the Chapmans' financial records." "And who might you be exactly?" Calloway's voice took on a dangerous edge. "A drifter who's overstayed his welcome, from what I gather. Your involvement in Mrs. Chapman's affairs is both inappropriate and unwelcome." "Mr. Everett is a valued friend," Pearl said firmly, "and he's right. The loan you claim exists never happened. The note is a forgery, Edward. A clever one, but a forgery nonetheless." Calloway's pleasant facade cracked further. "Be very careful with such accusations, Pearl. Forgery is a serious crime, one for which you have no proof." "Perhaps not yet," she conceded. "But Mr. Thornton has telegraphed the banking authorities in Pennsylvania. They'll confirm there was no such transaction." She stepped closer to him, her fear replaced by righteous anger. "You've been trying to take what belongs to me since the day of John's funeral. It ends now." For a moment, genuine rage flashed across Calloway's features before he composed himself. "You always did have more spirit than sense," he said coldly. "Very well, continue your investigations, but remember the note comes due in 3 weeks. Without $5,000 or proof of forgery that will stand in court, this charming little establishment will be mine." He reached for his hat. "Consider my offer still open, Pearl. There are ways to resolve this that would benefit us both." The insinuation in his tone made Weston's hand curl into a fist, but Pearl remained perfectly composed. "Good day, Edward. I won't be seeing you again unless it's in court." After Calloway departed, Pearl's shoulders sagged slightly, the strain of the confrontation showing in her face. Without thinking, Weston placed his hands on her shoulders, steadying her. "You were magnificent," he said softly. She turned to face him, still within the circle of his arms. "We don't have proof, Weston, not the kind that will stand against that document in court." "We will," he promised. "Whatever it takes, we'll find it." They stood there closer than they had ever been, the awareness of each other acute in the quiet room. Pearl's eyes searched his face, as if looking for answers to questions she hadn't yet asked. "Why are you still here?" she whispered. "The trails will be clear enough soon. Most cowboys would have moved on by now, debt or no debt." It was the question he had been asking himself with increasing frequency. The snow was no longer an excuse. He could have left days ago, returned to the familiar pattern of his solitary existence. Instead, he found himself becoming more entangled in Pearl's life, in the community of the boarding house, in Whispering Pines itself. "Maybe I'm tired of moving on," he said finally, the admission surprising even himself. "Maybe for the first time in years, I've found something worth staying for." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Pearl's lips parted slightly, her gaze dropping briefly to his mouth before meeting his eyes again. For a heartbeat, Weston thought she might close the distance between them. Instead, she stepped back, creating space but not retreating entirely. "We should tell the others what happened," she said, her voice steadier than before. "And plan our next steps." As they moved to join Miss Foster and the Wells brothers, who were waiting anxiously in the kitchen, Weston realized that something fundamental had shifted. The wall he had built against attachment wasn't just cracking, it was crumbling entirely. And for the first time since the war, the prospect of vulnerability didn't terrify him. Not if it meant standing beside Pearl Chapman, fighting for her home and maybe, just maybe, finding his own in the process. What neither of them could know was that Calloway had not immediately left town. Instead, he had made his way to the Silverton Saloon at the opposite end of Whispering Pines, where he now sat in deep conversation with three rough-looking men whose reputation for violence preceded them throughout the territory. Men who would do anything for the right price, including ensuring that a certain widow and her cowboy protector never found the proof they sought. The storm worsened overnight, confining everyone to the boarding house the following day. While the weather prevented any immediate action regarding Calloway's fraudulent claim, it created an unexpected intimacy among the residents. Gathered around the large kitchen stove for warmth, they shared stories, played cards, and discussed strategies for proving the forgery. "We need to examine the document more carefully," Samuel Wells suggested. "Forgeries often have small inconsistencies, the pressure of the pen, the spacing of letters. And we should compare it to other documents John signed around that time," his brother added. If Calloway forged it recently, he might have used a newer example of John's signature as reference. Pearl nodded, grateful for their support. Mr. Thornton said he'd have a response from Pennsylvania by telegraph as soon as the lines are clear after the storm. "That might give us something concrete." Throughout the discussion, Weston remained unusually quiet, his expression thoughtful. When the others eventually dispersed to their rooms for the evening, he lingered in the kitchen as Pearl finished tidying up. "You're planning something," she observed, wiping down the table. "I can see it in your face." Weston smiled faintly. "You've gotten good at reading me." "It happens when someone stays in one place long enough," she replied, a gentle challenge in her tone. He accepted the implicit question with a nod. "Fair enough, yes, I'm considering a different approach." He moved to help her with the dishes, their hands occasionally brushing as they worked side by side. "Calloway is too confident." "That worries me. Even with the letters we found, he doesn't seem concerned about us proving forgery." "Because he knows it would be difficult to prove in court," Pearl said, "especially with John no longer here to testify." "Exactly. So I'm thinking we need to find evidence from Calloway himself, something that reveals his true intentions or proves he fabricated the loan." Weston hesitated, then continued, "He's staying at the hotel across town. If I could get access to his room, look through his papers." Pearl stopped washing, turning to face him fully. "That's breaking and entering, Weston. You could be arrested." "Only if I'm caught," he pointed out with a wry smile. "It's too risky," Pearl insisted. If Calloway discovered you, he wouldn't hesitate to press charges. You could end up in territorial prison. Weston was touched by her concern but remained resolute. It's a risk worth taking. Pearl, this boarding house isn't just property to you. It's your home, your livelihood, your independence. I won't stand by and watch Calloway take it through fraud and intimidation. Pearl studied him, conflict clear in her expression. Why, she asked simply, why risk so much for my sake? It was the question that had been building between them for weeks, demanding an answer neither had been ready to acknowledge. In the warm kitchen, with the storm howling outside and no one else to witness, Weston finally faced it directly. Because in all my wandering since the war, I've never found a place that felt like somewhere I could belong, he said quietly. Not until here, not until you. He took a deep breath, gathering courage. I've spent years believing that caring about people, about places was dangerous, that it made a man vulnerable, and maybe it does. But these past weeks have shown me there's something worse than vulnerability. What's that? Pearl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Isolation, Weston answered, passing through life without ever letting anyone or anything matter enough to fight for. I don't want that anymore, Pearls. The confession hung between them, honest and unadorned. Pearl's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. Then don't risk prison for me, she said softly. If you truly want to belong here, to build something lasting, we need to fight this the right way. Her hand dropped to take his, together. Weston turned his hand to interlace their fingers, the simple connection more profound than any he had allowed himself in years. All right, he agreed, but we need a plan. Calloway won't wait much longer, and I don't trust him to play fair. Pearl nodded, squeezing his hand before reluctantly releasing it. Tomorrow, when the storm breaks, we'll go to Sheriff Taylor. He should know what Calloway is attempting in case things escalate. And we should warn the town bank as well, Weston added. If Calloway forged one document, he might try others. He could be planning to access your accounts or property records. As they continued planning, the domesticity of the moment struck Weston forcefully. Standing in a warm kitchen with Pearl, discussing a shared future, however uncertain it might be. It was exactly the kind of entanglement he had avoided for so long, yet now he couldn't imagine being anywhere else. Later, as he lay in his bed listening to the storm batter the boarding house, Weston reflected on the transformation taking place within him. The war had taught him that attachment led to devastation when people you cared about were ripped away. The frontier had reinforced that lesson with its harsh demands and casual cruelties. For years he had believed that emotional solitude was the only safe path. Now he understood that safety wasn't living at all, it was merely existing. Pearl Chapman, with her quiet strength and boundless determination, had awakened something he thought long dead. The courage to care deeply, to risk heartbreak, to fight not just for survival but for a life worth living. What he couldn't know, as sleep finally claimed him, was how soon that courage would be tested, and at what cost. The storm cleared at dawn, leaving whispering pines transformed into a glittering white landscape. Weston rose early, chopping additional firewood before most of the boarding house stirred. When Pearl joined him in the yard, her cheeks flushed from the cold, he was struck anew by her beauty, not just her physical appearance but the inner strength that radiated from her. Sheriff Taylor should be at his office by now, she said, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. We should go while Calloway is likely still abed. They made their way carefully through the snow-packed streets, the town beginning to awaken around them. At the sheriff's office, however, they found only Deputy Wilson, a young man barely out of his teens. Sheriff rode out to the Henderson place last night, Wilson explained. Their barn collapsed under the snow, and old man Henderson was trapped inside. Won't be back until this afternoon at earliest. This is urgent, Deputy, Pearl insisted. It concerns a potential fraud being perpetrated against me by Edward Calloway. The young deputy shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Calloway spoke with the sheriff yesterday, ma'am, said there might be some trouble over a legitimate debt. Sheriff told me to handle any complaints with professional courtesy, but to remember that legal documents speak for themselves. Weston and Pearl exchanged concerned glances. Calloway had already begun laying groundwork, influencing the sheriff before they could present their case. Can you at least take our statement? Weston asked, so the sheriff has our side of the story when he returns. Wilson reluctantly agreed, recording their account of the forged promissory note and Calloway's attempts to pressure Pearl into surrendering her property. Whether the information would make any difference remained to be seen, but at least they had made an official record of their concerns. Their next stop was the telegraph office, hoping for news from Pennsylvania regarding Calloway's financial activities. The operator, Mr. Simmons, greeted them with excitement. Mrs. Chapman was just about to send someone to find you. Got a reply from Philadelphia this morning. He handed her a telegram form. Came through as soon as the lines cleared after the storm. Pearl read the message aloud. Edward Calloway INVSTIGATD 4 Financial IMPROPRATIES Philadelphia Banking Commission. Stop left city under cloud of suspicion September last year stop. No record of large cash withdrawal corresponding to alleged loan stop. Exercise extreme caution in DEALINGS stop. This helps, Weston said. It establishes that Calloway had no funds to lend and was already under investigation around the time he claims to have made the loan. But it doesn't definitively prove forgery, Pearl pointed out. It's circumstantial. They were discussing next steps when Mr. Thornton from the bank hurried toward them, his normally composed demeanor visibly rattled. Mrs. Chapman, Mr. Everett, he called. Thank goodness I've found you. Something alarming has occurred. Calloway was at the bank first thing this morning, attempting to register a lien against your property based on the promissory note. Did you allow it? Pearl asked, her voice sharp with concern. Thornton shook his head. I delayed, citing procedural requirements and the need for judicial review given the circumstances, but he was most insistent, and I fear he may seek alternative means to enforce his claim. What alternatives? Weston asked, a sense of foreboding growing. There are less reputable individuals in town, Thornton said delicately, men who might enforce a claim through intimidation rather than legal channels. The implication was clear. Calloway might turn to violence if legal means failed him. Weston's protective instincts surged. Pearl shouldn't return to the boarding house alone, not until this is resolved. I won't be driven from my own home by threats, Pearl said firmly, though her face had paled. But perhaps the other boarders should be warned. They shouldn't be put at risk because of my troubles. As they continued their discussion, none of them noticed the man watching from across the street, one of the rough individuals Calloway had met with at the saloon the previous day. He observed their animated conversation with the banker, then slipped away to report back to his employer. By mid-afternoon, Weston and Pearl had returned to the boarding house, gathering the residents to explain the situation. Mr. Harrison, the Wells brothers, and Miss Foster listened with growing outrage as Pearl detailed Calloway's fraudulent claim and potential for escalation. This is your home as much as mine, she concluded. You deserve to know what might be coming and have the choice to stay elsewhere until it's resolved. Nonsense, Mr. Harrison said immediately. I'm not about to abandon you to face that scoundrel alone. In my 70 years, I've learned that standing together is how decent folk triumph over villainy. We're staying too, James Wells declared, his brother nodding in agreement. We may be mill workers, not gunfighters, but we can help protect the house. Miss Foster reached over to squeeze Pearl's hand. This is my home now. I won't be chased away by some Eastern swindler with delusions of grandeur. Tears welled in Pearl's eyes at their solidarity. Weston felt his own throat tighten, moved by this display of community of family that Pearl had created around her. These people, thrown together by circumstance, had formed bonds stronger than blood. As they discussed practical measures for security, taking shifts watching the approaches to the house, securing doors and windows, keeping lamps lit through the night, Weston found himself imagining a future here. Not as a boarder passing through, but as part of this unlikely family, part of Pearl's life permanently. The thought no longer frightened him. Instead, it filled him with a sense of purpose he had been missing since before the war. That evening, as darkness fell, Weston took the first watch from the front porch. The town was quiet, most residents having retreated to their homes against the bitter cold that followed the storm. A nearly full moon illuminated the snow-covered street, making it easy to spot any approach to the boarding house. Pearl joined him after ensuring the others had retired for the night, bringing a blanket and 2 cups of steaming coffee. She settled beside him on the porch bench, close enough that their shoulders touched. It's beautiful, isn't it? She said softly, looking out at the moonlit landscape. Even with everything happening, I can still appreciate that. Weston nodded, accepting the coffee gratefully. That's one of the things I admire about you, Pearl, your ability to find beauty even in difficult times. She smiled, the moonlight catching in her eyes. It's how I survived after John died. Finding small moments of beauty or joy each day, no matter how bleak things seemed. She hesitated, then added, "It's easier now, though." "Because of the boarding house doing well?" Weston asked. Pearl shook her head slightly. "Because of you," the simple admission hung between them. "Having you here these past weeks has reminded me that life isn't just about surviving. It's about connecting, sharing, building something meaningful with others." Weston set his coffee aside and tentatively reached for her hand. When she didn't pull away, he entwined their fingers, marveling at how natural it felt. "I've been running so long," he confessed. "From the war, from memories, from anything that might tether me to one place or person. I convinced myself it was wisdom, but really it was fear." "And now," Pearl asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "now I'm more afraid of leaving than of staying," he admitted. "More afraid of returning to that lonely existence than of whatever risks come with putting down roots, with caring for people, for you." Pearl turned to face him fully, her free hand reaching up to touch his face. This time there was no pulling back, no creating distance. "I never expected to feel this way again," she said softly. "After John died, I thought that part of my life was over, that my heart was finished with love." "And now," Weston echoed her earlier question, his heart pounding as he leaned slightly closer. "Now I'm terrified," she whispered, "because I could lose everything, the boarding house, my independence, my heart, all at once. But I'm also more alive than I've been in nearly 2 years." The distance between them vanished as Weston gently pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was tentative at first, both of them cautious with newfound vulnerability. Then Pearl's arms slid around his neck and the kiss deepened, carrying all the emotions they had been carefully guarding for weeks. When they finally parted, Weston rested his forehead against hers. "Whatever happens with Calloway," he promised, "you won't face it alone, and when it's over, if you'll have me, I'd like to stay, not as a boarder but as more." Pearl's smile was radiant even in the moonlight. "I'd like that," she said simply, "very much." The moment of perfect understanding between them was shattered by the sound of breaking glass from inside the house, followed by Miss Foster's frightened cry. Weston was on his feet instantly, drawing the revolver he had kept holstered at his side since their confrontation with Calloway. "Get behind me," he told Pearl, moving quickly to the front door. Inside, they found chaos. Two men had broken in through the kitchen window and were now in the main hallway, confronting the Wells brothers who had rushed downstairs at the commotion. Miss Foster stood on the staircase, clutching her robe around her, while Mr. Harrison appeared from his ground-floor room brandishing a walking stick. "That's far enough," Weston called, his gun trained on the intruders. "This is private property, and you're not welcome here." The men, rough-looking individuals Weston recognized as drifters who frequented the Silverton saloon, smirked at each other. "We're just delivering a message from Mr. Calloway," the taller one said. "The debt comes due tomorrow, not in 3 weeks. Pay up or clear out by noon." "And if we need to make the message clearer," the second man added, patting a bulge under his coat that was clearly a weapon, "we'd be happy to oblige." "Nice place you got here. Be a shame if it burned to the ground with everyone inside." Weston's finger tensed on the trigger. "You're threatening women and old men now, that the kind of men you are." "We're the kind who get paid to do a job," the first man replied coldly. "And we finish what we start. Noon tomorrow, Mrs. Chapman, money or property, or there'll be consequences no one here wants to face." With that, they backed toward the kitchen, clearly planning to exit the way they had entered. Weston followed at a distance, unwilling to turn his back on them but equally unwilling to start a gunfight inside the house with so many people at risk. Once they had disappeared into the night, Weston secured the broken window as best he could while Pearl calmed the other boarders. The sense of violation was palpable. The boarding house, once a haven of safety, had been breached. "We need to report this to the sheriff," James Wells insisted. "Breaking and entering, threats of violence, that's criminal behavior." "We will at first light," Pearl agreed. "But I doubt it will make much difference. Sheriff Taylor seems predisposed to believe Calloway, and these men will simply deny everything." Her voice was steady, but Weston could see the fear she was fighting to control. "No one sleeps alone tonight," he decided. "The Wells brothers in the parlor, Mr. Harrison and Miss Foster upstairs with access to the back stairs if needed." He met Pearl's eyes. "I'll keep watch from the kitchen where they broke in." As the others dispersed to this new arrangement, Pearl touched Weston's arm. "Be careful," she said softly. "They might come back." I'm counting on it, he replied grimly. Men like that get bold when they think they've scared their targets. If they return, I'll be waiting. Pearl's eyes widened with understanding. You're planning to catch them, to force them to reveal Calloway's involvement. Weston nodded. It may be our best chance to prove he's behind all this. Legal documents and telegrams might not be enough, but a confession from his hired men could turn the tide. It's dangerous, Pearl protested. You'd be outnumbered. Not if I have help, Weston said, glancing toward where the Wells brothers were arranging makeshift beds in the parlor. Between the three of us, we can handle 2 hired thugs. As they prepared for the possibility of another intrusion, Weston was struck by the irony of his situation. For years, he had avoided connections precisely because they created vulnerabilities, points of attack for an uncaring world. Now, he found himself willingly, even eagerly, standing as defender of not just Pearl, but an entire household of people who had become important to him. The solitary cowboy who had arrived at the widow's rest weeks earlier would never have recognized the man who now moved through the darkened house, checking windows and positioning the Wells brothers for maximum coverage of potential entry points. That man had believed safety lay in isolation. This man understood that true strength came from standing together, from having someone worth fighting for. As midnight passed with no further disturbance, Weston allowed himself to imagine a future beyond this immediate crisis. A future with Pearl, perhaps even expanding the boarding house, making it truly theirs. A permanent home after years of drifting. It was a vision that would have terrified him once. Now it was what he was fighting to protect. Dawn came without incident, though no one in the boarding house had slept soundly. Weston, who had maintained his vigil in the kitchen through the night, accepted a cup of coffee from Pearl as the household slowly gathered for breakfast. Sheriff Taylor should be back by now, Samuel Wells said as he helped Miss Foster prepare a simple meal. James and I will go speak with him as soon as we've eaten. I'll accompany you, Weston decided. Pearl should stay here with Mr. Harrison and Miss Foster. It's safer than being seen in town where Calloway might confront her. Pearl nodded reluctantly. Be careful, all of you. Calloway clearly isn't above using intimidation to get what he wants. After a hurried breakfast, Weston and the Wells brothers set out for the sheriff's office. The town was beginning to stir, shopkeepers clearing snow from their storefronts, the blacksmith's forge already glowing with morning fire. At the sheriff's office, they found Taylor had indeed returned, looking weary from his overnight mission to the Henderson farm. Sheriff, Weston greeted him. We need to report a break-in and threats made against the residents of the Widow's Rest boarding house. Taylor, a weather-beaten man in his 50s, who had served as Whispering Pines law enforcement for over a decade, sighed heavily. This about the debt Calloway mentioned. He was quite insistent that Mrs. Chapman is attempting to avoid payment on a legitimate loan. The loan is fraudulent, Samuel Wells stated firmly. And regardless, hiring men to break into a woman's home and threaten violence is criminal behavior. Strong accusations, Taylor remarked, though he began writing in his ledger. You have proof these men were working for Calloway. They said they were delivering a message from him, James Wells replied. Said the debt was due by noon today, not in 3 weeks as the document states. They threatened to burn down the boarding house with everyone inside if Mrs. Chapman didn't comply. Taylor's pen paused. That's concerning description of these men. As the Wells brothers provided details, Weston noticed a telegram on the sheriff's desk addressed from the territorial marshal's office. Taylor saw him looking and grimaced slightly. Got that this morning, he said, tapping the paper. Seems your Mr. Calloway has quite a reputation back east, suspected of multiple forgeries and fraud, though nothing proven in court. Marshall advises caution in any financial dealings with him. Weston felt a surge of hope. Then you believe us about the promissory note. Let's say I'm less inclined to take Calloway's claims at face value, Taylor replied carefully. But threats and break-ins are matters I can address directly. He stood, buckling on his gun belt. I'll have a word with our visitor and make inquiries at the Silverton about who he's been associating with. As they prepared to leave, the sheriff added, noon deadline, you said. I'd suggest you all remain at the boarding house. If Calloway or his men show up to press their claim, I want to be there to see it firsthand. The warning in his tone was clear. Taylor wanted to catch Calloway in the act rather than relying on second-hand reports. It was a reasonable approach from a law enforcement perspective, but it meant using the boarding house and potentially Pearl as bait. Back at the widow's rest, they found Pearl in the parlor with Mr. Thornton from the bank, reviewing property documents. The banker looked up as they entered, his expression grave. "I've been examining records of similar cases in the territory," he explained. "Unfortunately, without definitive proof of forgery, the courts tend to enforce promissory notes if they appear legitimate on their face. The burden of proof falls heavily on the party claiming fraud." "But we have the telegram from Pennsylvania," Pearl pointed out. "And now the sheriff knows Calloway is wanted for questioning back east." "Helpful but not conclusive," Thornton said apologetically. "What we need is direct evidence of the forgery itself or an admission from Calloway." Weston shared the sheriff's plan to be present at noon when the deadline expired. "He's hoping Calloway will show his hand, give himself away somehow. Or that his men will return and can be persuaded to implicate him," James Wells added. Pearl's face was resolute despite the fear that lingered in her eyes. "Then we'll be ready. This is my home. I won't surrender it to fraud and intimidation." As the grandfather clock in the hallway ticked toward noon, the boarding house took on the atmosphere of a fortress preparing for siege. The Wells brothers positioned themselves strategically, Samuel near the front entrance, James watching the kitchen door. Mr. Harrison, despite his age, insisted on standing guard at the foot of the stairs, while Miss Foster kept watch from an upstairs window that overlooked the street. Weston remained at Pearl's side in the parlor, his revolver within easy reach though not openly displayed. Sheriff Taylor arrived at 11:30, taking position on the porch where he could observe approaches from either direction. "Calloway checked out of the hotel this morning," the sheriff informed them. "Paid his bill in full and had his luggage loaded onto the eastbound stage, but he never boarded, according to the station master." "He's planning to leave town once he has the boarding house," Pearl said, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Probably sell it quickly and disappear before any investigation can catch up to him." The clock struck noon, each chime resonating through the tense silence of the house. Minutes passed with no sign of Calloway or his men. The waiting became its own form of torture, as the hands of the clock moved inexorably forward. At 12:15, Miss Foster called down from her lookout position, "Riders coming from the east, 3 men moving fast." Weston joined Sheriff Taylor on the porch, as 3 horsemen approached the boarding house at a gallop. 2 were the men who had broken in the previous night. The third, riding slightly ahead, was Edward Calloway himself. They reined in before the porch steps, Calloway's expression darkening at the sight of the sheriff. "This is a private business matter, Taylor. There's no need for your involvement." "When that business involves breaking and entering, threats of violence, and potential fraud, it becomes very much my concern," Taylor replied evenly. "I understand you're planning to leave Whispering Pines today, Mr. Calloway. Seems hasty for a man with legitimate business interests." Calloway's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "The stage doesn't wait for personal convenience, Sheriff. Now I'm here to collect on a valid debt owed by Mrs. Chapman. The deadline has passed. Either she pays the $5,000 or surrenders the property, as agreed in the promissory note." Pearl stepped onto the porch, her chin held high. "There is no valid debt, Edward, as you well know. John never borrowed money from you. The note is a forgery, and we both know it." "Careful, Pearl," Calloway warned. "Slander is a serious matter. I have a legally binding document with your husband's signature. Unless you can prove otherwise, the law is on my side." "Perhaps this might help with that," came a new voice from the side of the house. Everyone turned to see Mr. Thornton approaching, accompanied by a well-dressed man no one recognized. "Mrs. Chapman, Sheriff, may I present Mr. Robert Hanley, formerly employed as Edward Calloway's personal secretary in Philadelphia." Calloway's face drained of color. "Hanley, what are you doing here?" The newcomer stepped forward, his expression grim. "Doing what I should have done months ago, Mr. Calloway, telling the truth." He turned to Sheriff Taylor. "I assisted Mr. Calloway in forging multiple documents, including the promissory note he's using to claim Mrs. Chapman's property. I can identify the specific irregularities in the forgery that prove it's not genuine." "You treacherous," Calloway lunged toward his former secretary, only to find himself staring down the barrel of Sheriff Taylor's revolver. "That will do, Mr. Calloway," Taylor said firmly. "Mr. Hanley, I'll need your statement in writing. As for you, Edward Calloway, you're under arrest for forgery, attempted fraud, and conspiracy to commit intimidation." As the sheriff moved to take Calloway into custody, The two hired men exchanged glances and abruptly spurred their horses, attempting to flee. They hadn't counted on the Wells brothers, who emerged from both sides of the house, each holding one of Weston's rifles. Faced with armed opposition in both directions, the men reluctantly surrendered. "How did you find him?" Weston asked Thornton in amazement as Sheriff Taylor led a fuming Calloway toward town, the hired thugs following under the Wells brothers' watchful guard. The banker smiled modestly. "When I telegraphed Philadelphia about Calloway's financial activities, I received a response from Mr. Hanley, who had been seeking a way to make amends for his role in Calloway's schemes. He arrived on this morning's stage, the same one Calloway intended to take back east." Thornton turned to Pearl. "Your property is safe, Mrs. Chapman. With Mr. Hanley's testimony, the promissory note will be invalidated completely." Pearl's composure finally broke, tears of relief streaming down her face. Weston pulled her into his arms, holding her as the tension of the past days released in quiet sobs against his chest. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "Your home is secure. Calloway can't hurt you anymore." She looked up at him, her blue eyes shining through tears. "Our home," she corrected softly. "If you meant what you said last night about staying." Weston's heart swelled at her words. In front of Mr. Thornton, Miss Foster, and Mr. Harrison, who had gathered on the porch to witness the resolution, he cupped Pearl's face gently in his hands. "I meant every word," he promised. "No more running, no more passing through. I want to build something here with you." Their kiss was witnessed by the small family they had formed in the midst of crisis. The elderly teacher, the dressmaker, the banker, all smiling at this new beginning born from adversity. Later that evening, after statements had been given and Calloway secured in the town jail awaiting transport to territorial court, the boarding house residents gathered for a celebration dinner. The atmosphere was light, joyful, as if the house itself had been freed from a shadow. "A toast," Mr. Harrison proposed, raising his glass, "to Mrs. Chapman, whose courage never wavered." "To the Wells brothers," Miss Foster added, "whose steadfastness protected us all." "To Mr. Thornton and his perfect timing," Samuel Wells contributed with a laugh. "And to Weston," Pearl said, her eyes finding his across the table, "who reminded me that some things are worth the risk of caring deeply." As glasses clinked and conversation flowed around them, Weston realized he had found something he hadn't even known he was searching for. Not just a woman to love, but a community, a purpose, a place where his past didn't define him and his future held promise rather than endless wandering. The cowboy who had arrived believing that the frontier left no room for love now understood that love was precisely what the frontier needed most. The willingness to stand together, to build something lasting in the midst of hardship, to find home in another's heart when the world outside offered only wilderness. 3 months later, on a perfect spring day with wildflowers dotting the prairie, Pearl Chapman became Pearl Everett in a ceremony behind the boarding house, now officially renamed Chapman House in John's memory. Sheriff Taylor officiated, Mr. Harrison gave the bride away, and the Wells brothers served as groomsmen while Miss Foster stood as maid of honor. As they exchanged vows beneath an arch of fresh-cut pine boughs, Weston looked into the eyes of the woman who had healed his war-torn heart and found home reflected back at him. "I wandered for years," he said softly, for her ears alone as they shared their first dance as husband and wife, "never realizing I was looking for you all along." Pearl's smile outshone the setting sun as she leaned her head against his chest. "Sometimes the greatest journeys lead us exactly where we need to be," she whispered. "Welcome home, Weston Everett." And as twilight settled over whispering pines, the former drifter and the widow who had found each other in the midst of hardship stepped into a future they would build together. One day, one challenge, one joy at a time. For they had discovered what the frontier tried to conceal beneath its harsh exterior. That love, when given room to flourish, could conquer even the wildest of wests.